We just got the ruling. It is 92 pages long, and I'm scanning through it right now. But when I'm looking at these numbers, the totals that the judge is ordering collectively in the case, so this will include all of the defendants, I'm getting a total of $362 million. And I'm just scrolling through this now. I can see that there's the dollar amount specific to Donald Trump. I'm going to use a calculator to do some rough math. It gets us to, for Donald Trump, about $354 million. That's for him, the company, the Trump organization. So very close to what the New York Attorney General's office was seeking of $370 million. There's a lot of zeros here and a lot of other numbers, but roughly $354 million is the judgment against Donald Trump. The judge also found that his son, Eric Trump, is liable in the amount of $4 million. Donald Trump Jr. is liable in the amount of $4 million. And Alan Weisselberg, the former chief financial officer, is liable in the amount of $1 million. I haven't had a chance to read through the language of what the judge said here, but really this was about the money because
it is James Ice, and what I learned today genuinely shocked me. The $355 million fraud judgment against Trump is compounding daily, and with interest now exceeding $500 million, this financial nightmare is growing with ruthless, relentless, unstoppable precision. Interest has been piling onto that judgment at a rate that is almost difficult to comprehend, approximately $87,000 to $89,000 per day. Every single day that passes without Trump writing a check, he owes almost $90,000 more than he did the day before. By the time you factor in all the accumulated interest, the total judgment has already ballooned to approximately $464 million. And it continues its inexorable, merciless climb toward $500 million and beyond. Let that sink in for a moment. $500 million. And the clock is ticking louder every single day. This is not just a financial problem anymore. This is an existential threat to everything Trump has spent his entire life building. His empire, his brand, his identity, his legacy. Every property, every business, every asset he has ever claimed as proof of his success is now sitting directly in the crosshairs of a judgment that grows by nearly $90,000 before he even finishes his morning routine. Watch this explosive hearing unfold, and stay tuned for a full breakdown of everything that went down. Don't forget to subscribe and help us hit 100,000 subscribers.
The judge had already found that Donald Trump, his sons, and Alan Weisselberg had engaged in fraud by issuing fraudulent financial statements, giving them to banks and insurers in order to obtain favorable rates. He ruled that before the trial, but we did go through a 3-month trial. The judge was looking to determine how much in ill-gotten gains, is what this word of disgorgement means, the money that they benefited from. So now the judge issuing the significant ruling, more than $350 million against Donald Trump and the Trump organization and against the sons. I'm going to just see if I can quickly search to see what the judge said about any ban. That was the other outstanding question here. I'm not able to find that very quickly, but that is another issue that we're looking for here of what the judge says about whether he's banning Trump from doing business or his sons. But this ruling, there was a question of whether the sons would be found to be liable because the judge said at the end of the trial, during closing arguments, he asked the Attorney General's team if he said he wasn't sure there was sufficient evidence against the sons. This ruling here indicating that he believes that they did at least receive improper profits and asking them.
What makes this situation so immediately and acutely dangerous for Trump's entire business empire is that the judge's ruling allows enforcement mechanisms to proceed even while Trump's appeals are still pending. Normally, when you appeal a judgment, there is a stay, a legal pause that prevents the other side from collecting while the appeals process winds its way through the courts. That protection exists specifically to prevent irreversible damage before higher courts have had a chance to weigh in. But to get that stay, Trump would need to post a bond for the full amount of the judgment. And that is not just showing you have money sitting somewhere in an account. That means actually putting up real, tangible collateral that legally guarantees payment if he loses the appeal. Real assets, real security, real money on the table. And Trump has apparently been unable or unwilling to post such a bond, which means New York Attorney General Letitia James has the full, immediate, legally authorized green light to pursue enforcement right now. Not after the appeals, not after further court proceedings, right now, today. Let that sink in for a moment. And think about what this actually means in cold, practical, real-world terms.
To disgorge that as a result of this case. This is a significant win for the New York Attorney General, Letitia James. She'd been investigating this case ever since Michael Cohen testified before Congress when he made this first allegation that Trump had inflated the value of properties to get better rates on loans and insurance and to pay less in taxes. So she is now justified by this finding by the judge. And again, this was a judge trial. This was not a jury trial. So we've been waiting for Judge Arthur Engoron to issue this ruling. And now we have it. We still have to continue to read through it. Our team is doing that as I speak. But, a real significant win for the New York Attorney General and a loss for Donald Trump in this case that goes to the heart of his reputation, the reputation that he was a successful real estate businessman, that he rode to the White House. The judge finding here that, there was fraud, there was liability, and saying that Trump needs to pay back more than $350 million. Boris Brianna?
Yeah, it goes so much to his identity. This is clearly one of the cases, one of the legal issues that he's facing that bothers him the most here.
The New York Attorney General can place liens directly on Trump properties, clouding the titles and making it completely impossible to sell or refinance them without first paying off the full judgment. She can pursue actual seizure and force sale of properties to satisfy the debt. She can go after bank accounts, rental income streams, and any other assets wherever she can find them. Trump Tower, the gleaming building that has been the ultimate symbol of Trump's success and the headquarters of his entire operation for decades, could theoretically be seized and sold to pay this judgment. The building with his name on it in massive golden letters, gone, sold off to satisfy a fraud debt. And it is not just theoretical. 40 Wall Street, a major Manhattan office building, is specifically being targeted, according to Letitia James's own public statements about exactly where she is looking to collect. Trump's lawyer, Alina Habba, responded with a statement that they will be prepared to deal with whatever enforcement actions come. But that statement rings completely hollow given the apparent liquidity problems Trump is clearly facing. Because here is the simple, brutal truth. If Trump could easily post a bond and stop the enforcement actions dead in their tracks, he would have done it already. The fact that he has not tells you everything you need to know about the true state of his finances.
As the Attorney General in New York had argued that it was the marketplace that was harmed here and was seeking to recoup this disgorgement or these ill-gotten gains. Let's go ahead and bring in Paula Reed, our chief legal correspondent, to talk about what she is seeing here with our understanding here, Paula, that this is really kind of hot off the presses, this ruling.
Yes, the paper is still warm, but we're going through it right now. And as you and Kara were talking about, this case is so personal because it represents such a threat to Trump's business, his family business, and his identity. Remember, it was his identity as a businessman that brought him fame before he arrived at the White House. But in looking at the summary of this ruling, we see in addition to the monetary penalties that Kara just laid out, they have found him liable for fraud, and they are going to continue the appointment of an independent monitor. So back in 2022, the judge installed a monitor to keep an eye on exactly what the Trump organization was doing when it came to its business dealings. Now, among the things this monitor uncovered were a $48 million loan, for example, to the company itself, but there was no paperwork. They couldn't really find any information. That was just one thing.
Why has he not done so? The most logical and unavoidable explanation is devastatingly simple. He does not have the cash or the credit available to secure a bond of this magnitude. The cryptocurrency income we have discussed previously has provided some limited breathing room, but posting a nearly $500 million bond requires either having that much cash readily available or having enough unencumbered assets to use as qualifying collateral, real assets. Assets that are not already pledged, mortgaged, or tied up in other obligations. Trump apparently has neither. And here is what makes this even more darkly ironic. The fraud judgment itself came directly from a case where Judge Arthur Engoron found that Trump had systematically and deliberately lied about the value of his assets for years. inflating property values by hundreds of millions of dollars to secure better loan terms from banks, better rates from insurance companies, and a wide range of other financial benefits. The fraud was not a one-time mistake. It was not a difference of opinion about property valuations between reasonable people. It was not aggressive accounting that pushed against technical boundaries. It was a systematic, years-long pattern of deliberate deception. And now the man who spent years fraudulently inflating his assets on paper is discovering that those same assets cannot generate the real, tangible, unencumbered collateral he desperately needs to protect them from being seized. The irony is as brutal as it is fitting.
That came up. Now, Trump lawyers have insisted because they loaned the money to themselves, they didn't have the paperwork that they needed, and insist that the monitor has found no fraud. Now, the judge also here orders the installation of an independent director of compliance. But I also want to note that they are saying here, the judge is saying that they're going to limit the defendant's right to conduct business in New York for a few years. Now, it's probably going to take a few minutes before we unpack exactly what that means. That does not appear to be an indefinite ban, the so-called corporate death penalty, but it does appear that the judge is going to put some restrictions on Trump and the Trump Organization's ability to do business in the state of New York. But let's go back to the idea of this independent director of compliance that appears to be maybe an executive level person who will ensure that they are being honest when evaluating their assets, when applying for insurance or loans from banks. Because, of course, that is what the judge here found Trump liable for last fall before this trial started. They said, you are liable for fraud. They believe that he was not honest about the value of his assets because he was trying to get more favorable terms from banks, from insurance companies.
There was a pervasive, deeply rooted pattern of deception that infected Trump Organization financial statements over many years. And as part of the judgment, Judge Engoron also banned Trump from running businesses in New York State for 3 years. That is a remarkable sanction that reflects just how egregious the court found his conduct to be. And Trump is not the only one on the hook. His sons, Don Jr. and Eric, are also facing personal financial consequences from related judgments. Each of them owes $4.7 million from their direct involvement in hotel and golf course transactions that were part of the fraudulent scheme. Alan Weisselberg, the former Trump Organization CFO, who already served prison time for tax fraud, owes an additional $1 million in severance that is being clawed back. The entire senior leadership of the Trump Organization has been found liable for participating in the fraud, and they are all facing very personal, very real financial consequences. The political implications of potential asset seizure are absolutely enormous. Trump's entire brand has always been built on the image of success, wealth, and invincibility. The buildings with his name on them, Trump Tower most prominently, are the physical, visible manifestations of that brand. Having those iconic properties seized and sold by the state of New York to pay fraud judgments would be a humiliation that goes far beyond any financial impact. It would shatter the mythology Trump has spent decades carefully constructing about being a brilliant deal-maker and supremely successful businessman. And it would hand Democrats devastating imagery and talking points heading into every upcoming election. The timing of this threat coincides with absolutely everything else we have been covering. Trump is facing pressure from every possible direction simultaneously. And now, on top of all of that, there is an active, immediate, legally authorized threat to seize his properties and forcibly liquidate his business empire. The approval ratings suggest the public is already souring on Trump, and watching his buildings get seized would only accelerate that decline dramatically. So let us break down exactly what enforcement mechanisms are available to Letitia James and how asset seizure would actually work in practice. When someone loses a civil lawsuit and a judgment is entered against them, the winning party has various legal tools available to collect what they are owed: wage garnishment, bank account seizure, liens on property, and ultimately forced sale of assets. The specific tools available depend on the jurisdiction and the type of judgment. But New York provides robust, powerful enforcement options that Letitia James can deploy against Trump right now if he does not pay voluntarily. The normal way to pause enforcement while appealing is to post an appeal bond, also called a supersedeas bond. This bond functions essentially as insurance that guarantees payment of the judgment if the appeal ultimately fails. It protects the winning party from having their judgment become uncollectible during the years it might take to fully resolve the appeals process. To post such a bond, you typically need to either deposit the full judgment amount in cash or have a bonding company guarantee payment, which requires providing collateral they can seize if needed. For Trump, posting a bond of nearly $500 million has apparently proven impossible or prohibitively expensive. Bonding companies that might guarantee such an amount would need to see collateral unencumbered assets worth significantly more than the bond amount that they could actually seize if Trump loses and does not pay. And here is the brutal reality. Trump's claimed billions in assets apparently do not translate into the kind of liquid, unencumbered collateral that bonding companies actually require. Properties with existing mortgages do not work as collateral because the mortgage holder has priority. Volatile assets like cryptocurrency may not be acceptable. And Truth Social stock, whatever it is theoretically worth on paper, is illiquid and heavily restricted. Without a bond in place, James can pursue enforcement while the appeals proceed. She has been completely clear and utterly public about her intentions, stating directly that she will seek judgment enforcement and seize assets if Trump does not pay. She specifically mentioned 40 Wall Street as a property she is actively watching, suggesting it may be among the very first targets for enforcement action. The enforcement process would likely begin with placing liens on Trump properties. A lien is a legal claim against property that must be satisfied before the property can be sold or transferred. Once liens are in place, Trump could not sell or refinance those properties without first paying off the full judgment. This alone would significantly constrain his financial flexibility, since selling or refinancing properties is often exactly how real estate operators generate the liquidity they need when cash runs short. If liens do not produce payment, the next step would be actual seizure and forced sale of properties. This process generally involves the sheriff or marshal taking physical control of the asset and conducting a sale, often at public auction, with proceeds going to satisfy the judgment. And these forced sales typically produce far less than market value because buyers know the seller is in distress and has absolutely no ability to hold out for better offers. Trump could see properties worth hundreds of millions sold for a fraction of their true potential value. The properties most vulnerable to seizure are those with significant equity, substantial value above whatever mortgages or other liens already exist. If a property is mortgaged up to its full value, there is nothing for James to collect, even if she seizes it. The existing mortgage holders would have priority and would take all the proceeds from any sale. But properties with substantial equity represent real targets where seizure could produce meaningful recovery toward the judgment amount. Trump Tower presents a complicated situation. The building's commercial space has suffered from high vacancies and declining rents, and its value may be significantly less than it was at Trump's peak. But Trump Tower has symbolic significance that goes far beyond its financial value. Losing the building that has his name on it in massive gold letters, the building that has served as his headquarters, and the physical centerpiece of his identity for decades, would be a devastating, possibly irreversible blow to Trump's brand and self-image. 40 Wall Street, a major office building in Manhattan's financial district that James has specifically and publicly identified as a target, has also struggled since the pandemic with elevated vacancy rates and declining rents. But if there is meaningful equity in the property above existing mortgages, James can and will pursue it to satisfy part of the judgment. And the interest accumulation is a relentless, merciless factor working against Trump every single day. At approximately $89,000 per day, every day of delay adds to what he owes. Over a full year, that is more than $32 million in additional liability, just from interest. The longer Trump goes without paying or reaching a settlement, the deeper the hole gets, and there is no obvious mechanism to stop the interest from running. It continues automatically, without pause, without mercy, as long as the judgment remains unpaid. The interest alone is adding the equivalent of a luxury home's value to what Trump owes every single day. Trump's sons face their own personal exposure from the related judgments, and this is not just their father's problem. Don Jr. and Eric each owes $4.7 million, meaning they could face their own enforcement actions affecting their personal assets. Their own properties, bank accounts, and other assets could be targeted if they do not pay. They are personally liable for their participation in the fraudulent schemes, and that personal liability is very real and fully enforceable. Alan Weisselberg's situation illustrates how the Trump Organization's legal problems extend far beyond Trump himself. Weisselberg already served prison time for tax fraud related to his compensation arrangement with the Trump Organization, and now he owes an additional $1 million being clawed back from severance he received. The systematic nature of the fraud involving the company's CFO who managed the books, the sons who participated in deals, and Trump himself who directed the entire operation shows this was not a rogue employee or an isolated incident. This was a company-wide culture of deliberate deception. The 3-year ban on Trump running businesses in New York that Judge Engoron imposed as part of the judgment carries its own significant implications. Trump is currently president, so the immediate practical impact on his day-to-day life may be limited, but the ban reflects the court's formal conclusion that Trump cannot be trusted to run businesses honestly and should be legally prohibited from doing so. That finding, from a judge who reviewed extensive evidence and heard weeks of testimony, speaks to fundamental, deeply troubling questions about Trump's character and integrity that no amount of spin can erase. The appeals process that Trump is pursuing offers some theoretical hope of reducing or eliminating the judgment, but legal experts are generally deeply skeptical that he will succeed. The trial record established pervasive fraud through documentary evidence that is extremely difficult to dispute on appeal. Trump's financial statements contained valuations that were demonstrably and provably false, claiming Mar-a-Lago was worth many times what it could legally be sold for, inflating apartment square footage by thousands of feet, and similar fabrications across multiple properties. Appeals courts generally defer to trial judges' factual findings when they are supported by substantial evidence, and in this case, the evidence was overwhelming. Now imagine the political implications of actual property seizure, because they would be extraordinary and devastating. Imagine news coverage of sheriff's deputies or marshals entering Trump Tower to take control of the building. Imagine auction notices for properties bearing the Trump name plastered across newspapers and websites. Imagine Trump forced to watch as his empire is systematically dismantled piece by piece to pay judgments resulting directly from his own proven fraud. The imagery would be completely devastating. The self-proclaimed billionaire genius, stripped of his properties because he cheated and got caught. The man who wrote books about the art of the deal, watching his deals literally be auctioned off to the highest bidder. The mythology Trump has spent a lifetime constructing depends entirely on the appearance of success, and having his property seized to pay fraud judgments would shatter that mythology in ways that would be absolutely impossible to spin or deny. The bond posting failure is the single most critical detail that makes this situation so immediately dangerous. If Trump could post a bond, he could pause enforcement entirely and fight through the appeals process without worrying about asset seizure. The fact that he has not done so after months of trying strongly suggests he simply cannot. And that tells us something profoundly important about his actual financial position. That despite the cryptocurrency income and the claimed billions in assets, he does not have access to the liquidity or the unencumbered collateral that posting such a bond actually requires. The enforcement process itself would unfold gradually, but with absolute relentlessness if James proceeds. First would come liens on properties, clouding titles and freezing Trump's ability to sell or refinance. Then would come seizure proceedings, where properties are taken under court supervision. Then forced sales, likely at auction, where distressed conditions typically produce significantly below market prices. Each step would be publicly documented and covered extensively by every major media outlet, creating a slow-motion, painfully public disaster for Trump's image and his finances simultaneously. The impact on Trump's ability to fund political operations also deserves serious consideration. Presidential campaigns and political operations require enormous amounts of money. If Trump's assets are tied up in litigation, subject to liens, or being actively seized, his ability to self-fund political activities would be severely constrained. He would become far more dependent on outside donors, which creates its own complications, constraints, and obligations. For the Trump Organization as an ongoing business entity, asset seizure would be absolutely existential. The company's operations depend directly on the properties it owns and manages. Losing major properties to forced sale would shrink the business dramatically and permanently. The brand damage from having Trump-named properties seized would devastate licensing deals and other reputation-dependent revenue streams. The company might survive in some drastically reduced form, but it would be an unrecognizable shadow of what it once was. Trump's response options are limited, and getting more limited with every passing day as interest continues to accumulate relentlessly. He could try to settle with James for less than the full judgment, but she has shown absolutely no inclination to offer significant discounts to a defendant whose fraud the courts have already conclusively established. He could try to raise the money from outside sources, but borrowing nearly $500 million when your assets are already heavily encumbered is extraordinarily difficult. He could hope to win on appeal, but the evidence against him was overwhelming, and appeals courts rarely overturn factual findings this well supported by the trial record. The comparison to other real estate empires that have collapsed throughout history is deeply instructive. History is full of once mighty real estate developers who overextended, faced judgments or market downturns, and watched their empires liquidated in forced sales. Trump has always presented himself as different, smarter, more successful, somehow immune to the failures that befell others. Asset seizure to pay fraud judgments would prove definitively that he is not different at all. Just another over-leveraged developer whose claims vastly exceeded reality. Looking ahead, the enforcement timeline is largely in James's hands. She can proceed as quickly or as slowly as she chooses within the legal framework, and she has made absolutely clear that she intends to pursue enforcement aggressively. That suggests we could see actual lien filings and seizure proceedings in the coming months rather than years. Every major step in that process would generate enormous news coverage and continuously remind the public of Trump's fraud conviction and deteriorating financial position. The psychological impact on Trump of losing properties that bear his name should not be underestimated. Trump's entire self-image is deeply and fundamentally tied to these properties. He spent decades pointing to buildings with his name on them as proof of his greatness, his genius, his success. Having them stripped away through forced sale to pay fraud judgments would be personally devastating in ways that go far beyond any financial calculation. This asset seizure threat represents one of the most immediate and existential dangers to Trump's empire and his carefully constructed public image, the enforcement mechanisms that James can deploy without waiting for appeals, the massive daily interest accumulation making the hole deeper with every single sunrise, the iconic properties like Trump Tower that could be seized and sold to the highest bidder, the underlying fraud findings showing systematic, deliberate, years-long dishonesty, and the shattering political implications of the self-proclaimed billionaire genius having his properties stripped away to pay for his own proven cheating. The numbers are genuinely staggering, and they keep getting worse with each passing day. The original judgment was $355 million. Interest has pushed it to approximately $464 million and climbing toward $500 million and beyond. At $89,000 per day, every single week adds more than $600,000 to what Trump owes. Every month adds more than $2.5 million. Every year adds more than $32 million, just in interest alone. And Letitia James has the green light to move right now, today, without waiting for any appeal to resolve. This enforcement situation is going to develop rapidly in the coming months. Whether Trump can somehow raise the money to post a bond, whether he can reach a settlement, whether James follows through on her very public and very serious threats. All of it will unfold with massive implications for Trump's finances, his brand, his political future, and ultimately, his legacy. And if you think Trump's situation is precarious right now, just wait until sheriff's deputies show up at Trump Tower to begin seizure proceedings. The self-proclaimed king of real estate, the man who wrote books about the art of the deal, is facing the very real, legally authorized, actively pursued possibility that his entire empire will be dismantled piece by piece to satisfy a judgment that resulted directly from his own fraud. The irony is almost too perfect to fully comprehend. Trump spent decades claiming he could get away with anything, that the rules simply did not apply to him, that he was too smart, too powerful, too well connected to ever truly face consequences. And now he is facing those consequences in the most public, most humiliating, most unavoidable way imaginable. The buildings with his name on them, the symbols of his supposed greatness, could be taken from him and sold to the highest bidder at public auction. The brand he spent an entire lifetime building could be destroyed in a matter of months. This is no longer just about money. This is about legacy. This is about the fundamental question of who Donald Trump really is. Is he the brilliant businessman he has always claimed to be? Or is he just another fraud who got caught? The courts have already answered that question with devastating clarity. Now the enforcement mechanisms are about to make that answer painfully, publicly, and permanently clear to the entire world. The assets will be seized, the properties will be sold, the empire will crumble, and all that will remain is the truth, that Donald Trump built his fortune on lies. That is the story that is about to unfold in real time for everyone to see. And it is one that no amount of spinning, no amount of denying, and no amount of truth social posts can stop. You are watching James Reed. Hit subscribe and help us reach 100,000 subscribers, and drop your thoughts in the comments below.